Off the eastern bank of the southern Atchafalaya River, 14 miles into the swamp, there's a tiny island of land caused by the conjunction of 4 bayous. This island was once called Tigerville. The first settlers that came here around 1870 1770 found 2 tribes of Indians, the Washoe and the Chawasha, both branches of the Choctaw Nation, and a large number of puma, 150, 180-pound mountain lion. This is the reason that this island of land was called Tigerville. The main section of the town was located between Big Bayou Black and Tiger Bayou. In the 1770s, there may have been 2 people living here. By the 1800s, there may have been a dozen people living here. By the early 1820s, the town had begun to grow, and by the time that the railroad arrived here, it wasn't because of the importance of the town. The railroad just happened to be passing through. But it was interrupted by the Civil War, so Tigerville was its terminus. And that terminus was located in Big Bayou Black at the junction of Tiger Bayou, so that steamboats could get next to the railhead and exchange freight for the continuance of the trip to the west. By the time that the railroad arrived here, there may have been 100 people living in this place. Well, soon after the railroad arrived was the Civil War. And we were affected by the Civil War due to the fact that the North sent a garrison of troops to this island because of the importance of that railhead into Big Bayou Black and the bayou itself, which at that time was the main highway through South Louisiana. Well, the troops stayed here until 1865 when the war was finished, and they went back home. And then, after things settled down for a few years, around 1870, the big sawmill company started moving in to cut the virgin cypress. On the island of Tigerville, in 1870 began the first commercial cypress sawmill in the parish of Terrebonne. This is a mill that, at the peak of its operation, cut about 20,000 foot a day. It was owned by a man named Fritz Fandel, who came out into this jungle from New Orleans to pioneer the industry, and was later regarded as the grandfather of sawmilling in this parish. Well, he was the beginning of the big lumber barons, and I can remember Mr. Fandel before he died. He was a frail, thin man, very nervous, very easily agitated, didn't seem to be sure of himself. his mind had probably slipped right at the last, and he wound up dying a poor man. Had invested the remains of his fortune made in the lumber business into a harebrained scheme, thinking that there was gold to be found at the base of this one of the Indian burial mounds located in this town, and spent his life savings having this place excavated to find an empty hole. Well, Mr. Faslun lived in a house in his later years located near the foot of one of these hills, and that excavation was actually in his backyard under the ruins of what was then a baker shop, baking bread. This was a thriving town, a booming logging community at one time, and we had everything here that a modern town of its era had, and including a hotel, a two-story hotel at that, several bar rooms, 2 general stores, 2 churches, Methodist and a Catholic, and butcher shop, a baker shop, and a moss gin. Moss gin in itself was a large industry. The moss was picked in the swamp locally, and when I was a kid, I used to make money during the school holidays selling moss to the gin. If you picked it and sold it green, it was 3 cents a pound. But if you processed it and then sold it, you could get 12 cents a pound for it. So we'd throw it in the bayou for 2 weeks and let it rot, and then haul it out and lay it on drape it over a fence to dry, and that gray outer covering would have died by then and turned all black, and then we sell it to the mill and to the gin, and they would run it through a series of spiked wheels similar to a cotton gin, which would shred it and rip this rotted covering off of the fiber, and the fiber as it or the covering as a dust was drawn off, and nothing but the fiber remained, which was baled and shipped around the country to stuff automobile seats, living room furniture, mattresses, pillows, little girls' dolls. They extracted an ingredient from it as a substitute for carnauba wax. It was woven into horse bridles and blankets, and used for anything else which required a good, strong fiber, which the moss possessed. Now, the town of Tigerville was formally named that in 1847. And in 1888, it was changed to Gibson because of a politician bribing the local people, which were mainly Catholics, by offering to donate a bell to their church in exchange for them voting for him. Well, he was elected, and he gave the church the bell like he promised, and in gratitude, the people changed the name from Tigerville to Gibson after him. His name was Randolph Gibson, and he was a U.S. Senator. His father, Tobias Gibson, was a Methodist missionary sent out of the First Methodist Church in the South, located in Franklin, Mississippi. He was sent out here into this jungle of South Louisiana to establish a congregation for the Methodists here, and was successful in doing so by the establishment of the very first Methodist church in the state of Louisiana. And it is located on this island of land, which was once called Tigerville. It's still here. It's still being used twice a month, and it has been used continuously since it was built in 1849. It's in its original condition, except for electricity added around 1960. It was commandeered by the federal troops guarding the railroad and the bayou, and they used it as their hospital during their stay here, because it was the only public building in town. The Catholic Church wasn't built yet. The Methodists were the first ones here. And it's been admitted to the record of historical places in the United States. And back in the very beginning of this this island establishment, and I keep calling it an island because it's a large, high piece of land totally surrounded by swamp. And only the strong of heart and will would have ever come to a place like this back in those days. We're talking back in the late 1700s. There was nothing here except raw jungle, virgin cypress forests, Indians, and a lot of cats. Well, with the coming of the white man, and that was, the white man regularly came here starting about 1770. The Indians just disappeared. They virtually vanished. No trace. No one knows where they went, how, why, or even where. But the cat, resourceful as it was, just moved off of this island and moved on to another island further back in the swamp, where white man still does not go until this day. I discovered that island about 1984 on an exploratory trip into the deeper regions of the Atchafalaya Swamp, when I was scouting my path for a deep swamp route. Now, what brought the people to this island on a regular basis was an incident that happened. It started happening probably around 1860 and on through 1870 to 1875. New Orleans, which was founded in 1718, grew very rapidly, probably beyond the expectations of the people around, and pretty soon they found themselves in a dilemma of not having enough beef to keep the people fed. So the guiding fathers of the city, in all of their wisdom, concocted a plan to have beef cattle driven from Mexico and Texas, and those cattle drovers were probably the first people who came through this island on a regular basis, driving the cattle to market in New Orleans. Now, this island of land is situated on the route of the Old Spanish Trail, or I should say the Old Spanish Trail is situated on this island of land, or passed through this island of land. Actually not through it, but more like around to the northwestern side of it, following a bayou called Atchafalaya Bayou. They didn't follow Big Bayou Black because Big Bayou Black didn't run east and west. It ran in an inverted loop from north to south, and consequently did not go in the direction that the explorers, the Spaniards, wanted to go in. See, the Spaniards landed in Florida in the 1500s, and they walked across the United States to the Pacific Ocean, checking out this newfound property. And on their route through, they created what is now called the Old Spanish Trail, which happens to be the oldest non-Indian trail in the United States. Now, those cattle drovers, which drove the cattle to market in New Orleans, followed this Old Spanish Trail into market. The Old Spanish Trail followed a succession of bayous from approximately the Mississippi border around Pearl River, through all of this floodplain, and which terminated at Morgan City once you cross the Atchafalaya River. They pushed those cattle through this floodplain and through many rivers on their trail here. And back then there was no bridges or ferries or boats, and so the men and the cattle did a lot of swimming. When those cattle drovers could find a large piece of dry land that was suitable for grazing and letting the cattle rest, they would stop periodically along the trail and let the cattle rest and eat, keep that weight up so they wouldn't lose too much money when they got to New Orleans. And I suspect, there's no proof of this, but I suspect that those cattle drovers were probably the first people who came through here on a regular basis, and may have been the first people who settled this place, who lived here permanently. And I also suspect from my research that there have been people here on a continuous basis since about 1800. My uncle, or great-granduncle, as I should correctly identify him, was a man named Henry Schuyler Thibodaux. And the town of Thibodaux, Louisiana today, was named after him. He lived in Shreva, had a home in Shreva. That's where he died. After having been governor of Louisiana in 1824, he died in 1827. Well, he and a man named Jim Bowie of the Bowie knife fame were good friends, and traveling companions. And prior to my uncle's governorship in 1824, he and Jim Bowie were the instruments in civilizing, I might say, and settling this land, the southern section of Louisiana down here in this floodplain. My uncle was instrumental in having Inter-Lafourche Parish separated into two separate parishes, and the upper part of Lafourche, Inter-Lafourche, remained Lafourche Parish, and the southern part of Inter-Lafourche became Terrebonne Parish, which means good earth, Terrebonne. So all of this exploration and running around done by my uncle and Jim Bowie was done prior to my uncle's governorship. That's back when they were younger. Young men, healthy men, with a keen mind and a sharp sense of adventure, and they rode through this country on horseback, carving out trails and getting communities started. My uncle donated the original piece of land that the town of Houma, the original town of Houma, was founded on. And the town site wasn't the county seat or the parish seat. These are called parishes here in Louisiana. Everywhere else they're counties. The parish seat in Terrebonne Parish wasn't formed until 1828, and this section of Terrebonne Parish had a land transaction which dated to 1827, which is a year before the county seat was established at Williamsburg, which is about 4 miles north of the original town site of Houma, which later became known as, Williamsburg did, later became known as Bayou. And then in later years it was moved to Houma, where it remains to this day. So there was a lot that went on out here that there's no records of. We don't know anything about it. All the people who were around that could have told us about the beginning, the birth of Tigerville, are now long gone. But the town was surely here before 1827. That land transaction was a piece of land sold by Jim Bowie, who lived 6 miles west of Tigerville on Big Bayou Black at a place called Greenwood. He sold this piece of land to a man named Lemur Tanner in 1827. And I guess they remembered it because when they started the courthouse in 1828, it was still it was included in their records. Incidentally, the federal troops who were camped here during the Civil War, the reason that they were sent down here was to guard the railhead extending into the bayou, Big Bayou Black, and to keep Big Bayou Black under their possession, under their control, because these two conveyances were very important to any campaigns which might have developed here, but there were no battles in this town. The nearest battle was Lafourche Crossing, about 3.5 miles below Thibodaux. This is the crossing of the Spanish Trail and the Lafourche Trail, and that was an important spot, but down here it didn't get to any battles. The town of Gibson, as it became in 1888, was mainly settled by Irish, French, and German. I read from an Irish family named McIntyre. There were O'Bries, O'Rooks, Cannons, Rochelles, Walters, and a lot of French, including the Thibodaux. My grandmother lived just on the edge of the white section of town. In fact, I believe that her house is the last white family before the colored section started. Because back in those days, until the 1950s, this was all highly segregated country. But segregation was not really a problem with us, because down here your labor force is probably 50% black, because I imagine they could hire them real cheap. And they worked side by side with the white men in the big sawmills. Now there were a lot of these big sawmills throughout South Louisiana. This is green gold, I guess you'd call it. Every town of any size had its own sawmill, and there were maybe 30 sawmills strung out through the southern part of Louisiana, all cutting the big cypress. Well, 2 miles from Gibson was the second to biggest of all these sawmills ever in the state of Louisiana. The biggest of which was a sawmill called the Lutcher Moore Mill in the town of Lutcher, which is about 20 miles north of the present city of New Orleans. And I would imagine that this big mill cut about 250,000 feet a day. But we had the distinction here of having had the second to biggest sawmill, and it cut about 200,000 foot a day, and it was called the Donner Cypress Lumber Company, owned by 3 men, Mr. Dibert, Stark, and Brown. Mr. Dibert was from St. James, Louisiana. Mr. Stark was from Orange, Texas, and Mr. Brown was from Beaumont. And they came down here. Well, actually, they didn't. They were very crafty gentlemen and real businessmen. So I don't know which one of them volunteered his wife, but they sent one of their wives into Gibson, and they loaded her pocketbook up with a lot of money and told her to buy land, which she did. And she was paying, offering a good price for it, so she had no problem at all securing 100 square miles of swamp at 50 cents an acre. This is in 1900. By 1903, her husband and 2 other men, those 3 men were the Dibert, Stark, and Brown families, moved in to what was then Donner, and set up this big mill, and they operated from 1903 to 1936. This is the mill that was responsible for the town of Gibson growing up into a boom town. Before the big mill arrived, there were people living and working here and working at the Gibson Cypress Company, the Cypress Lumber Company. They may have been a couple, 300 men here then. Incidentally, the Gibson Cypress Lumber Company closed because of the big flood, big Louisiana flood in 1927. The water rose 8 feet, and Gibson Cypress Lumber Company went out of existence. But the big mill at Donner did not, and it was the only mill in South Louisiana which did not close because of that flood. They had chosen, because of a lack of available dry land, natural dry land, to build a levee around the swamp, approximately about a square mile and a half of swamp. I used to think it was about 4 miles, but revised my figure to 1.5 miles. They built this levee around it and pumped it out and made their own dry land and moved this big mill in. And they cut that cypress in the swamp until 1933. That's the year that they had taken all the commercial-sized trees out. And then the big mill closed in 36. That 3-year lag between the end of the timber felling and the mill closure was to get the lumber that was already cut, the green lumber, dry, back through the mill for processing, and then they just shut it all down. Well, that big mill's town site, they had 3,500 people living back there in the woods. That town site was called Donner. When the big mill closed, a lot of the workmen migrated over to the closest town to them, which was called Cote Rouge back then, and they all went over there and fattened up the town and got together and dropped the name Cote Rouge and applied the name Donner to it. And that's how Donner became the town of Donner today. Sawmill town, it was sold by the company to the people who lived in the houses for $25 a house, but you had to tear it down and move it to your property. And what they didn't sell, they just abandoned. And later, after the company had moved out and there was no one around, the local people came back in and scavenged all that good cypress lumber. I, as a kid growing up, can remember when houses were still standing in the town. They had been abandoned. I was born in 1934. The mill closed in 1936. So at 2 years old, I didn't remember any of it, but by the time I was about 10 or 11, I had gone back into the old mill site, and part of the town was still intact, part of the mill building was still there, and you could plainly see automobiles parked on the street, which have now rusted and melted down into the ground, and about the only thing that's left are the well-made roads. You can see their layout, and the garbage dumps from the old town site of Donner. Now, the Donner mill produced every conceivable type of wooden product that was commercially usable at that time, including boxes, barrels, coffins, window sashes, shingles, cross ties for the railroad, spindles, banisters, pickets for fences, and all this fancy gingerbread woodwork that you see on these old southern mansions decorating the porches and so forth. They also planed about 40,000 foot of lumber a day. They turned out no telling how many thousands of feet of molding. They had a giant molding mill there. I would guess that they made 100,000 foot of molding a day. And they made tongue and groove, and they made beaded ceiling, and every other wooden product that was used back then. The mill was a building under 2 stories of roof. It was steam powered by a single cylinder horizontal engine. It produced 600 horsepower at 72 RPM, and it was lined up very close to the bandsaw, which took the first cuts on the big cypress logs as they came out of the mill pond. These logs were up to 9 feet in diameter, and the bandsaw just slabbed pieces off of them, which went through a gang saw, which is many blades on a common shaft, and then that slab became lumber, which went out to a lumber yard to air dry in the sun from 2 to 3 years. And it took that long because of all the moisture that's in Louisiana air. And then once they had it dry, they passed it back through the mill for processing, and then it was shipped out by rail to mostly the eastern seaboard of the United States, throughout the South, the eastern seaboard, and a little up the northern central states. The mill shipped its lumber out by Southern Pacific Railroad, which was a standard gauge track, and they had a spur coming into the mill yard. But the mill company had its own railroad. They had 15 miles of their own track, narrow gauge, and 6 locomotives operated on it, all steam powered. And each locomotive every day pulled 2 loads of logs out of the swamp, and pulled them up to the side of the mill pond and dumped them in. This kept the mill fed. That was just partial supply. The remaining supply was brought in by water in big rafts towed through the series of logging canals dug by the company into the big groves of cypress. And there were 2 little boats that I remember when I was a kid, because the big rafts of logs came through Big Bayou Black up until about 1940 or 41, right at the beginning of the Second World War. When the big lumber company, Diamond, Stark and Brown, shut down, they were running out of the big trees big enough to keep a mill that cut 200,000 foot a day fed. So it was uneconomical for them to proceed, and they sold their timber rights, not the land, just the stumpage, to a company out of Morgan City called Norman and Bro. And Norman and Bro cut up until the Second World War and towed the cypress logs to the mill in Morgan City, which is a trip of about 18 miles. And I remember going to the Norman and Bro mill, and it was a huge mill, it seemed to me. And Dr. Stark and Brown was even bigger, so it's kind of hard for me to realize how big that mill really was. I also went into the mill in Franklin before they tore it down, and that was a gigantic mill. And then the Lutcher-Moore mill was the biggest in the state, so that would boggle the mind of a kid trying to think about it back then. I just wish I would have been old enough to see it all in operation, so that I would have the complete grasp of the history that all went with it. The little history that I've dug up has come from oral interviews from the old men that are still living, which worked at the mill, and from some taped interviews of people who moved away from here that had worked at the mill, and from my bottle collecting, or my bottle hobby. I'm a glass collector, and I've dug most of the dump sites in the old town site of Donner, which revealed a lot of the history of the town as far as how the people lived. And from what I can tell, they didn't suffer too much. It was primitive, but it was accepted back then because that's all they had. They were modern for their time, but primitive for our standard now. But they did live quite well. They didn't suffer for too much. They ate quite well. They had products shipped in from as far away as New York City and London and Paris. And a lot of stuff came out of New Orleans, and it was brought in by rail. That's mainly what the railroad brought into the mill site was food and supplies and coal to keep the boilers fed. Everything at the mill was powered by steam. There's 6 boilers located there, and they boiled bayou water, which wasn't too kind to the boilers because of all the organic vegetation in the water. And the steam was used not only to drive the mill, but also to power an ice house, which was the only ice house in this area outside of New Orleans. At that time, normally the ice is brought out by rail and stored in a holding room, an insulated building where they would dispense it to the local people. And then when they ran short, they would have another train load of ice brought from New Orleans, where it was made. But the town of Donner, the Cypress company, sawmill company, made their own ice right at the mill site because they had the town to supply. And I guess they figured it was more economical to make their own ice than to buy it out of New Orleans. It may have been. Also, they produced electricity, which no other town around had, including Morgan City, Houma, and Thibodaux. This mill ran round the clock. They were open 24 hours a day. The machinery ran 22 hours a day. And they shut down at 11 p.m. and opened at 1 in the morning, and that was used for lubrication and maintenance. 22 hours around the clock, and in that length of time they cut 200,000 feet of green lumber. Well, they had to have electricity for running at night, and also produce electricity for the town site, but the town site's electricity was cut off at 10:30 at night. They would blink the lights in town at 10 o'clock, and then at 10:30 all lights were taken off. And the interesting thing about this generating plant for the electricity is that it was all DC power. Now the highest paid man in the whole mill operation outside the owners or the managers, I'm talking about common labor, was the man that operated the big bandsaw which took the first cut on the log as it came out of the pond. He was paid $1 an hour. And common mill labor in the mill, like in the planing mill or the shingle mill, they were paid 9 cents an hour. The reason the sawyer was paid $1 an hour is because he had an important job in the fact that he could either make money for the mill or lose money for the mill in the way that that log was cut. A certain way that you cut it, it yields more and better quality boards. So he had an important job. They wanted to keep him. Keep that sawyer happy, so you keep producing that good lumber and making that top money for them, of which they were getting $40 a thousand for the lumber. It was costing the mill $9 a thousand to produce it, and they were charging $40 for it. Consequently, a net profit of $31 a thousand. They cut 200,000 feet a day. So it wasn't a little nickel and dime operation. Now the timber fellers out in the swamp, in comparison to the price, they were paid 22 cents per man per tree to fell and prepare the tree to be pulled. The preparation entailed chopping the tree after it was down, cutting the limbs off of it, cutting it into 2 or 3 sections, and tapering the small end of each section so that it would track smoothly out of the swamp. Now, the tree also had to be felled in a particular direction, which the timber fellers were very accurate in doing. Naturally, they wanted the small end toward the direction that the tree was being pulled in, so that it would track better. And they moved on to another tree and could cut 6 to 7 a day, making about $1.40. And the pulling team came in to get the tree out of the swamp, and that meant anchoring a barge, which was the pull boat. It had a double drum steam-driven winch on it. It would anchor it to the opposite bank that the tree was being pulled from, opposite bank of the bayou. And so that the tree, as it was pulled out of the swamp, it could be drug into the bayou, where if it was cut at the right time, it would float, and they could raft it and then tow it to the mill. Now, that right time to cut that tree was either on the wane of the moon or during the winter when the sap was down, a green cypress won't float. It sinks, it'll go right to the bottom. And out there in those old logging canals, there are many, many of those sinkers, we call them. There's a lot of sinkers in the pool boat runs where the chokers broke and the log was underwater, and they just didn't bother about getting it out. They pulled the rest of the grove and then moved on to the next one. And how they did that, cypress grows in a grove only. It's in the cedar family, and that facilitated their operation quite a bit, because all they had to do was dig a canal to the center of the grove, make a pond for the pool boat to work in, where it sent out its cable about every 15 degrees around the perimeter of the pond. Once the pool boat made one complete circle of the pond, the whole grove had been pulled to the center, into the pond, rafted, and pulled onto the mill. A rough calculation on the profit that these three men made at the rate of $31 a thousand net profit, cutting 200,000 feet a day for 33 years. They made roughly, or they took roughly $66 million worth of Louisiana's natural resources back to Texas with them. And they made a total net profit of $66 million. 44 million was taken back to Texas, and only 22 million stayed here in Louisiana. That's a pretty good return over about $250,000 original investment to set it all up. They hired a man by the name of Chester Gable as engineer. He engineered the whole thing, oversaw its construction. Worked as the mill manager for 20 years, quit the company, moved to North Carolina, where he built two other mills similar to Donner for some businessmen up there, and then in his later life constructed a mill very similar for himself. And as far as I know, his descendants are probably still in North Carolina. And his brother, Lester, succeeded him as the mill manager after he left. Now, nothing stopped the mill from operation. Prohibition, Depression, the biggest flood in Louisiana's history, the levee around their property saved them. And the only time they ever shut down was in 1918 when a mill fire burnt the whole sawmill to the ground. And supposedly it was caused by lazy workmen not wanting to climb up into the rafters of the building to lubricate a bearing on a line shaft. Got hot, caused a spark, which ignited the dust in the rafters, and the whole mill went down. But all they did was bring in a brand new mill. They shoved the other one, their old burnt machinery, into the mill pond and brought a brand new mill in and kept right on cutting. Well, it's all a thing of the past now. It's long been abandoned, 52 years. And the jungle has reclaimed the area fairly well. Huge trees are now growing, sycamores, cottonwoods, gums, big oaks, willows. And if you didn't know just walking through it, you could never tell tell that there was anything ever there except for the foundation of the mill building and a dry kiln. It's the only building still standing on the property. The reason that the dry kiln is the only building still standing is because it's made entirely out of brick and it is not deteriorated. It's about 3 stories tall, big enough to put about 4 standard railroad flat cars inside of it. And then they'd seal it up and they could dry a load of lumber in about 3 weeks rather than 3 years. And this would hurry up any special orders they had. When the Big Donner sawmill closed down in '36, a lot of the people that lived in Donner moved over here to Gibson. There were 5 nationalities that lived back in the town site. They each had their own little section. There were Irish, German, Italian, French, and Negro. And they all spread around. Some of them moved up Big Bayou Black. Most of the Italians went to Thibodaux and to Morgan City. A few might have gone to Houma. There's one particular story about a little incident that happened at the mill with the Italians. The mill owners told the Italians to keep their goats, their milk goats, pinned up so their sharp hoofs wouldn't damage the freshly milled wood that was stacked up. The goat would climb up on anything. And the Italians wouldn't comply, so the mill owners got together a bunch of men one night. They went over and they kidnapped all the goats and put them on a boat and took them way out into the swamp to a place called Goat Hill. And they deposited them on this hill where supposedly they're here to this day, or their descendants are. I've never been able to quite locate this spot. I have an approximate location, but I've not been able to get to it. It was very remote. The Italians wouldn't listen, so the mill owners didn't want them to get their goats back, so they hid them from them. Oh, it must have been a grand time back then. There was lawlessness and no jails. Take the problem in hand and settle it on the spot immediately. There's no juvenile delinquency, very, very little crime. Everything ran pretty smooth. You worked for the big company and the big company took care of you. Almost from cradle to grave, if they would have lasted long enough. It was the biggest town around at one time. There was talk of making the town of Donner the county seat because it exceeded the town of Houma, which later became the county seat in population. Bigger than Thibodaux, bigger than Morgan City. It must have been a grand place. Gibson must have been a real bustling little frontier community. We had several firsts here in this town. The first railroad, the first Methodist church, the first commercial sawmill. We were stopped on the first path going through the United States. And incidentally, that path, the old Spanish Trail, through Gibson, followed a bayou called Atchafalaya Bayou. That was the name of an Indian tribe which lived in a place which is now called Atchafalaya, about 6 miles from Gibson. And there was a sawmill there too. In fact, there were two of them. Actually, one sawmill and two shingle mills. Every little place had its own mill. See, back then, the only way to transport anything was by wagon through the old Spanish Trail, over the old Spanish Trail, or by steamboat through the bayou systems, but both were very expensive. So with the coming of the railroad, there was an easy way to ship the product out to the market. And then came the big industry, the big businesses, the big mills that came on in. Well, the sawmill ended in 36. The town dwindled in size. It lost its boomtown sparkle. But it was saved by the discovery of oil in the western end of the parish where we're located at the Gibson field in 1937, and that kind of kept things going. It didn't cause any boom, but it kept the town on the map. The town may have vanished if it wasn't for that. And then as oil grew up to the height of its boom in 1982, we had over 3,000 people living here. During the height of the lumber era, there was over 2,000. Right now, in 1988, there's probably a little less than 2,000. And I rather like it. Smaller, quieter and slower, and more like it was in the old days before the sawmill boom. The Donner Mill had been in operation about 8 years when my father was born in 1911. And my father came from Berwick, Louisiana. He was the son of an immigrant from Stockholm, Sweden. Our last name is Faslun, F-A-S-L-U-N. That's the modern day spelling, and it lost a few letters during the different generations that it was transferred on. Back in the old days, I've been told that it was spelled F-A-U-S-H-L-A-U-N-D, which meant a brook, a lun, that's the lun, running through a group of trees, a fash, hence the name Faslun, a brook running through a group of trees. Well, my daddy was born in Berwick. He came out here into the swampland and found a little coon-ass gal, I guess you could call her Cajun, my mama, French and Indian descent, married her. I think they were married for around 38 years when he died in 1980. Had 3 children, my brother and I, and a sister. My sister's the youngest, I'm the oldest. Well, my dad didn't have much of an education. I think he went to about 7th or 8th grade in school. He was a steel worker. He worked for Chicago Bridge and Iron. And he traveled all over the eastern part of the United States working for the company, up the Shenandoah Valley and up in the Blue Ridge and the Smokies, through the Tennessee Valley and up the Mississippi Valley. And later when he married my mother, he was working as a fireman when he married her in Berwick. And when he married her, he quit the fire department and went to work for Oyster Shell Products, a company out of New York City that had a oyster shell processing plant in Berwick. And he worked on a boat called the Ideal that would tow the barges of raw shell into the plant. It was a big steam tug. My daddy always talked about it. And we lived in Morgan City at the time, and that's how I could tell my daddy was coming home. The old tug, when it was pulling up to the dock, would always blow its whistle. And you could hear that whistle all over Morgan City and Berwick. Miles it would travel. And I knew, I guess about an hour later, my daddy would be coming in, and I'd run down the street to meet him. I was happy to see him. I got along real good with my dad. My dad wasn't afraid of work. Work didn't scare him at all. After I was born, when my brother was born, he left Oyster Shell Product Company, and this was back around the beginning of the Second World War. He went to work for the Navy. He worked in a shipyard for the Navy, building dry docks in Morgan City. Shipyard there because these dry docks are huge structures which could pick up an entire battleship for service, and the only way that they could test them was to have a spot where the water was deep, and the Atchafalaya River is the deepest river in the world. There are places in it over 600 feet deep, and therefore there was easy access to deep water, so the Navy brought in this big shipyard. My daddy worked there until after the war. Then he did several things after that. He bought some shrimp boats, and he tried shrimping. He tried a little painting business on his own, and neither one of them worked out too well. He made money at it, but it was just a bare minimum living. So he went to work for a company called Magnolia Petroleum and worked for them for several years until he was laid off. And then he went to work for Brown and Root, running a paint sandblasting gang. Before that, and right after the war, we lived in Houston for a while where he was an industrial painter. He lived a couple blocks wide by supermarket #1 in Houston. And I remember my daddy coming home during the day. They used respirators. I don't even know if they knew what respirators were back then. He'd be caked with paint all up in his nose, all over his face, his clothes. It took him, it seemed like an hour or two to get himself cleaned up every day. He'd walk in the house and all you could see was two little slits where his eyes were. I still believe until this day that was part of the reason why he died so young at 69. It's because the lead base and the paint caused him circulation problems in his later years, and I finally killed him because he did die of circulatory problems and heart trouble. Atchafalaya Basin Tours service, which are operating out of Gibson. People from all over the world, both Venezuela and Florida, the rail side of Louisiana looks like. This tour service was started in 1976. It is the oldest operating tour service in the state of Louisiana, doing swamp tours. Now think about it. After his series of highs and lows of our life, because of economics, I went back into business with another fellow building the Louisiana people. We used to stack them up outside the building and we went in. And passing on the highway, you could see these traditional Louisiana crop and figure, well, these guys must know what's going on. Let's stop and ask them, well, we can find somebody to take us out and show us his company. About then, in 1975, no one was doing that. I had been doing it for friends and relatives since about 1968. So in 1976, I went into the tour business, and about 1978, I went out of the pirogue building business and stayed in the touring business, which I'm doing to this day. This is June the 18th, 1988. And I imagine with my financial obligation with the bank, I'm going to be doing this for at least another 4 to 5 years. So I have a little custom-made aluminum boat called a mud boat. I fit 6 people in it. I only run 6 people at a time. But in the area where I go, you can't get a big boat in there. You can't be like the big operators when they run 20 people at a time on these party barges, because those operators capture people from real Louisiana. And that's what my focus is all about. And incidentally, my boat is called the Swamp Fox. It's Swamp Fox 2. I was born and raised here in Gibson. Actually, to be technical about it, I was born in Thibodaux at the old hospital, which is no longer there. And I probably stayed up there a 3 days and spent the rest of my time here in Gibson until 1955, when I got out of the service. I went to California and got an education, got an occupation, got married, got a family, and got a worldly education. And after gathering all this hot new technology from my college education and working in the industry for a few years, I spent a total of 10 years out there, 7 years in Los Angeles. Well, after all this experience I had, I was a hot new mechanical design engineer. Thought I'd bring back all this good information and apply it to Louisiana to help them come up to modern day standards. We're running, in some aspects, 10 to 15 years behind anywhere else in the United States. It's the backward way of thinking. Well, that backward way of thinking almost caused me to starve to death, because the attitude of the people is, if it works, why change it? If my father used it like this for 100 years, why do we need to make it better? So, shortly after I got back, within 3 years, I had to quit trying to be a personal success and go to work for another company. And it got me into the diving business, designing equipment for subsea. And then the business started slowing down, and they started me tending to keep me on, because I was valuable to them. They just didn't want to let me go. So I tended for a while until I learned how to dive. Then I dove for a while, and then dove for 2 or 3 different companies and made pretty good money. And that's the money that I used to start Bayou Boat Works, which is the company that made the Louisiana pirogue, little wooden paddle boats. And I just told you the rest of that story. And that brings me pretty much up to date on what's been happening with myself, except my plans for the future, which are to perhaps take this business one step further into getting the building next door and starting a nightclub, sort of a business, a place where my customers can go and get some Cajun food and a cold drink and a place out of the sun to wait for the tours, and maybe music 2 or 3 nights out of the week, and just a good time for all. And when I get that set up and running smoothly, then I plan on fulfilling my childhood dream to go down into the Brazilian jungle. And what I'll probably do down there is set up a business similar to the tour business that I'm operating here in Louisiana, but on a broader, a more intense scale. I want to take people, probably by helicopter, into a landing site near a natural Indian village, and take them in to live with the natives for about a week and let them feel the culture rather than just look at it. And that about summarizes my plans for the future. At the present time, about the only other thing that occupies my time other than my business is my love for my dogs. I raised the American Pit Bull Terrier. I got my first 2 pit bulls in 1960. And for the last 8 years, this will be 9 years this year, I have been continuously raising these dogs, and now I have 8 generations of my line of breeding on my yard. I call my line of pit the Diablo line. And I'm working on a 10 generation pedigree, at which time I'll have double registration, which will substantiate my goal in my breeding program, and probably increase the price of the dogs if I ever get back into selling them again. As of now, with all the bad publicity, I am not offering any more puppies for sale to the public. And the color of my particular line of pit, I've been trying to stabilize black-nosed reds. That is a red dog with a black muzzle. They're a very handsome color of dog, and fairly well conformed, not like all the pictures you see of the bad dogs in the magazines and TV, the ones that are eating up people. But they're fairly well conformed, and I've stabilized their color fairly well. By the time I get through 3 more generations, I will have reached my goal of a stable color and stable conformation and stable temperament, which is what we're all breeding for. I've had mild success with my program, and I'm quite happy at the results that I've arrived at so far. Since my family has become so disjointed and separated, about the only one that I really get along with now is my brother. Sometimes he's aggravating. My dogs have become my family. I have 14 on the yard now. 7 of them are puppies. My adult dogs are Jaws. That's my old main dog. She's a great-grandmother, retired. I have Rojo Hugar, which is my main male. I have Rojo Hijo, Rojo Duro, Rojo Fuego, Rojo Calar, and little T2. T2 is a fine little bulldog, strong, loves people to death, but he was born with a deformed tail. We call him a screw-tail bulldog. He's got a little tail that looks like a pit bull, like a pig. It's like a little puny pig. It's a little short tail, broke about 3 or 4 places. It's kind of like a little nub. He wiggles it back and forth. And always happy to see people. He was sold, resold, sold again, and finally given back to me when the people had to leave the United States to go on a job. They couldn't take him with them. So I got him back. Besides my dogs and my glass collecting hobby, about the only thing other than that which occupies my time that I'm interested in is target shooting, for which I have very little time to do. I have a few guns, and I have a complete hand-loading facility. So load special loads. Sometime I get out and fish a little bit, but I'm not much of a fisherman, and however I do enjoy it. But what I really like to do is camp, and I don't have any opportunity to do that anymore because the good camping spots are so far away, and I have to be close by to run tours, so that alleviates any possibility to get out into the wild anymore. Maybe like when I can organize this touring operation better and get it on its own footing and get it self-sufficient, maybe then I can have a chance to get out and do a little more camping. But the camping that I'll probably be doing will be down in Brazil or somewhere down in South America. In April of this year, the very first published article about my business, about this tour business, came out, and because of it came a flood of customers, which was good in a way but bad in another, because I couldn't handle them all, and it made a lot of people disappointed. So I need to expand. I need this place next door. I need to move up if I'm going to do anything with this at all. I don't have any help. I'm doing it by myself. Once in a while, a friend will come out of Homa, a fellow named Andre Cayuet. Here lately, a fellow named Rusty Stout has been coming from Morgan City. My friends are few and far between. I don't like most people because I don't like their lying, their cheating, their thieving, their deceitful ways, their lack of truthfulness. So I do not possess a lot of what I call friends. I run this business by myself from the very beginning without any help whatsoever. And I guess in the end, somebody's just going to inherit it for free. And I hope my son and daughter enjoy it and operate it correctly. And if we're lucky, hopefully in the next 5 to 10 years, the new 4-lane highway, US 90, will be completed through Gibson and hooked up to the west. And that will bring a wealth of traffic flow through here. It will establish Gibson on the map and bring prosperity to this business. It's a beautiful land, a beautiful place, and by the time that I realize my goal, it may well be on its way to dying out from man's intervention. Polluted skies, polluted waters, polluted lands. Back when I was a kid, it was clean. Everything was clean. Now everything is dirty. Slowly, the land and the people are dying. The largest incident of cancer in the United States occurs between Baton Rouge and New Orleans along the Mississippi River, and it's caused from all the chemical plants in the area dumping into the river from which we get our drinking water, and dumping into the air which we breathe, and dumping onto the land which we live on. The great North American Indian tribes and all of their supposed savagery had a far better method of living than white man will ever achieve. I do not think that there is any hope for man as long as he remains greedy. Man will surely kill himself and everyone else and everything else around him. It would be a shame, after over 200 years of Cajun culture, that in another mere 50, we all may be gone. Unlike my father, if I live to be an old man, one of the reasons for it is because that I, with my modern day education, have realized the things which do us in. The air pollutants, the water pollutants, and the pollutants in our food, in the food chain. Since 1975, I have been drinking Kentwood spring water only. And this month, I have switched from spring water to pure distilled water because our groundwater systems, our aquifers, have become so polluted that now I do not trust even the spring water. It's a shame that with a land as great as ours is, and with the beauty of it, and the wildlife, that man should be so stupid that his greed will kill him, all in the quest of money. The last dawn of a great era has come and gone. The prosperity of easy pickings in the timber and the oil industry has peaked. The timber may come again in another 40 or 50 years, but the oil, once it's gone, is a non-renewable